All right, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. My name is David Godwin, and I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange Program with the University of Florida. We're joined today by Laurel Kays from NC State University, and Marianelle Armstrong from the University of Florida and Tall Timbers Research Station. We're really excited about our webinar today. Glad you have chosen to take some time to join us. And I'm certainly looking forward to our presentation by Jim Cox from Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee. Jim is going to be talking about Herbert Stoddard and his role as a pivotal leader in shaping modern ecosystem management. And so finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Jim Cox is the director of the Stoddard Bird Lab at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, Florida. The focus of the award-winning lab ranges from assessing how fire management affects habitat for several birds that inhabit coastal marshes and upland pine forests, to performing hands-on activities that benefit red-cockaded woodpecker, brown-headed nuthatch, and the frosted elfin, which is an imperiled butterfly. The lab also strives to convey complex issues on land management and habitat conservation to the general public by writing popular articles, extension booklets, dozens of field trips annually. Jim received his Master's of Science from Florida State University, where he studied genetic variation among North American blackbirds. So Jim, we're excited to have you here today. We're excited to learn with you and from you about Herbert Stoddard and the impact that he has had in the Southeast and in ecosystem management across the country. So without further ado, one moment as we trade out presentations. Thanks again, Jim, and everyone for joining us today.
Great. Yeah, greatly appreciate the introduction and all the great work the Exchange does, and great series of webinars that are available for everyone to look at when they're not burning. And I'm sorry we're taking up a very nice day to be burning in many places around the country here, but it's an important topic for sure. Herbert Stoddard and ecosystem management. Just like to kind of start off with the idea of let's see. You know, if you ask the around the world what ecosystem management is all about, there are a million different ideas about what it is. It's one of those kind of things that basically everyone has their own idea about what it was and is. And I actually can remember a pretty stunning statement. I was in a local planning meeting about 10 years ago with a bunch of local planners. And at one point, one of them, I was talking about rare species, gopher tortoises, and red-cockaded woodpeckers. And one of the people there said, well, we're not concerned about rare species, we're just concerned about ecosystem management, which, how you define it can be pretty vague. And I like to sort of draw the point that I think Herbert Stoddard probably defined it as well as anyone before it was even a term that we even discussed very much. And today's presentation just kind of goes through the work that Herbert Stoddard did and the amazing things that he accomplished. And is the reason I think he's one of the top and most important historical figures in conservation in North America. He born at the turn of the century, late 1800s, and lived until 1970. Very astute person. He actually was born up in Illinois. He lived there for about only about 2 or 3 years. His father died about 2 weeks after he was born, and his mother remarried. And then she remarried this guy who thought he could make a fortune growing oranges in Florida. So they quickly decamped from Illinois and moved down to a small town east of Orlando and began to live there. Of course, when you move down into Florida, you're dealing at that time with the history, dealing with the open range situation where people were cattle ranchers let their cattle roam everywhere, and they would come in each year and harvest the ones that had their tags on them. But the burning was a very important component of managing these systems down there in the eastern part of Florida. And the reason for that is that everyone knows there's not a lot to eat in these particular systems. And so these ranchers would once, usually in winter or early spring, burn the woods. The wiregrass would respond real quickly and provide great forage for the cattle. And then later on, after the wiregrass had been kind of senesced and hardened, other species of plants would be used by the cattle as well. So Stoddard was immersed at a very early age in a landscape where fire was being used for a very important purpose. And this was one of the factors, that kind of settled into his brain really quickly, that fire was not a destructive force, but something that was very helpful. He also became very fascinated with birds at a very early age. At age 7, he saw a ground dove building a nest, and he wrote this phrase about seeing that dove. The discovery launched me on my career as a student of birds and marked my beginning as an ornithologist. And his lifetime absorption began in that yard where I watched the ground dove on her nest. Now, I'd like to point out there were no Peterson guides at this point, back in the early 1900s, late 1800s. He fortunately had a neighbor whose name was actually William Bartram, not the William Bartram, but who sort of took Stoddard under his wing and saw his interest in the natural world and really helped him learn things to identify the species in the area, plants and animals. And so Stoddard was actually mentored very well by a person that was, not directly related to the family down there at that time. The other thing that Stoddard got to see too, that's hard for us to even imagine today, was the original longleaf landscape. The timbering in Florida did not begin to happen really super fast until all the very early 1900s. So Stoddard, when he moved down there, actually got to see some of the old growth longleaf that hadn't been cut. And this was a very important thing that left a lasting memory on him throughout his life, was the original forest that he saw down there and experience of cutting elsewhere in the Southeast. For example, this is a picture from a small town called Wauchula that's about 70 miles southeast of where Stoddard was back around 1910, showing the magnificent longleaf pine, wide open old growth trees, gnarly topped and everything, spreading out over a landscape that's wide open because of use of fire. So 3 things very off at the very beginning. He saw fire being applied, he fell in love with birds, and he also got to experience some of the original landscapes here in the Southeast. These were very important to his later thinking about things. His mother moved back up north into Wisconsin. She basically Stoddard in Florida. He actually stopped going to school at about age 7 so that he could help maintain the family going. So he basically hunted to provide food, hunted to provide pelts for money, and really became a sort of this wild hunter throughout the area back there at a very early age. When they moved back north in Wisconsin, he worked on a farm for about pretty much permanently the entire time that he was away, and basically didn't have much formal schooling up there either. He's basically sort of quit schooling around 8th grade to help support the family. And this shows a picture of him around age 18 with a gray fox that he had lassoed on a property up there up in Wisconsin. But he was really interested not in just providing money through his work as labor, but also in taxidermy. Taxidermy was a pretty important profession back in the 1800s, early 1900s. It wasn't a very long-term prospect. There weren't many taxidermists sometime around 1950 or so, but at the turn of the century, it was a really important and a highly sought-after sort of profession. And so after he worked for 15 hours on the farm, he would spend a lot of his time sort of perfecting his skills at taxidermy, and at night, struggling to master this other skill. Fortunately, there were some other taxidermists in the area who took a liking to Stoddard. One of them was a guy named Ed Oxner, who lived nearby and had little connections to some museums elsewhere in Milwaukee or in Wisconsin and Chicago. And also, fortunately, the Ringling Brothers Museum's winter home was near where both of these guys, Oxner and Stoddard, lived. And occasionally they would have animals die, and Ed Oxner would come in, offer to come in and help scalp the, pull the bones out and take the skins off of these animals. And he heard about Stoddard, and he invited Stoddard to come help him one time, particularly when they lost a hippopotamus. Oxner was kind of sort of inspired by Stoddard's work ethic, and he invited George Shrewsbury, who was with the Milwaukee Public Museum, to help them when they skinned an elephant down there at the Ringling Brothers winter home. Stoddard participated with that, and George was really impressed with his work ethic and how thorough the detail that and the commitment he put into this very hard work was very gruesome, and not many people that he knew of were willing to do it. So he offered him a job in the Milwaukee Public Museum as the assistant taxidermist there. And that really got Stoddard's a very lucky thing that happened to him, and really got him launched into this career where he could basically visit a lot of the other museums in the East and work with people such as Frank Chapman, and really got to know the birding community, the museum community, and they could sort of admire his talents as well too. So a very good start, very lucky thing for a person who only had an 8th grade education. So he started traveling around with the other museums, doing collecting from up into Canada, all over the place, and just basically getting himself immersed with the museum culture of the staff that were working there. This shows a particular venture with the American Museum of Natural History that they took up into Canada one time, and Stoddard was along on that. One of the other really important things that Stoddard did too this was a time where people were just starting to place bans on birds so they could study their movements. And Stoddard saw a very great possibility in this tool for monitoring bird populations. And he helped to found what was called the Inland Bird Banding Association. This particular picture is actually a picture that Stoddard took of a group of people trying to net blackbirds so that they could put bans on them and then hopefully recapture them at some point. And this bird banding was one of those sort of incidental things that eventually would prove to be a very important thing in Stoddard's life. There's another picture showing Stoddard when he's much older, banding a bunch of chimney swifts on a chimney up, chimney up in near Thomasville, Georgia. I just want to point out that he was sort of reckless at some points and really didn't adhere to OSHA rules about safety and things. And I personally would not even have tied that rope around me. I would have rather just fallen off and probably been killed rather than be only partially saved by that rope. At this time too, the Red Hills region of Florida and Southwest Georgia was taking on some very special characteristics too. At the turn of the century, there was a big influx of industrials, northern industrialists into this area because the train traffic didn't go much further south. And this area provided great opportunities for sports hunting. Very millionaires from the Cleveland area, New York, and other places moved down here, and they began purchasing these properties at the turn of the century to turn them into nice hunting estates that they would visit each winter. It include people such as in the lower left-hand corner, the middle person there is Fleischman, who was headed up the East Company. They included a lot of members of the Standard Oil Company, some people in New York. Basically, again, they would come down here each winter to hunt quail and then go back up to their more complete jobs up there during the outside the winter months. One of the things that was sort of impressed these people was the fact that the locals really love to burn the woods up, and they insisted on burning the woods to help maintain the quail and these other species here. So the person who eventually owned Tall Timbers was here, and he, when he first came into the area, and he was sort of aghast at the fact that the land managers after he purchased the property were burning up the woods. He couldn't quite understand what was going on. But soon these landowners began to realize that burning was very important to some of the quail population as a fundamental part of the management they were doing in the region. Unfortunately, that wasn't a very widely held belief. The federal government at the time had very bad views about burning and the effects that fire had on forests, and they actually had put a lot of money into suppressing fire. There's this group called the Dixie Crusaders running throughout the Southeast at this time with films and very elaborate sort of lecture series and everything else to try to get people to stop burning up the woods because they thought it was destructive. Sometimes they would make statements such as more game are killed by fires than are killed by hunters. And so it was a very active effort to suppress the use of fire. The course took on a sort of pejorative nature too. The idea that these are just a bunch of dumb young rednecks running around tossing out matches, burning up the woods was kind of a nice way to sort of polarize the people who were engaged in fire management in this area. And so it was a really steep, very strong effort to suppress fire in the region. Well, this quite naturally had some concerns from the landowners who had seen fire being used to help quail and felt that fire would be was doing them very good advantages on their property management. And so there was a meeting in the Lynx Club in New York City, which is a private club. Some of the landowners in the regions got together and decided that they should fund a study of quail since they thought that fire was so important to just, to demonstrate that this was actually a very beneficial land management tool for quail. At this meeting, one of the other lucky strokes for Stoddard was the fact that there was a person there who was married to one of the families down here. He didn't, his name was Prentice Baldwin, and he banded birds. And he had heard about Stoddard, but he was down here banding birds whenever he visited during winter on these properties. Here's a picture of Prentice Baldwin out catching birds, and he thought that bird banding could be a way for these landowners to study what the fire effects were on quail. So at this meeting, Prentice knew Stoddard and recommended that they consider giving the position to Stoddard to come down here and study the quail. It's a fortuitous thing because that's exactly what happened. Stoddard picked up, moved down here, and began operating the 5-year program to study the effects of quail on the bobwhite here in the Red Hills region. He used the technique of banding. This type of walk-in trap that he uses here to catch quail and band them is still the same type of trap that we use today. And from this, he started piecing together that fire was not detrimental at all, but was actually very important to quail. You probably saw got to experience fire on a first-hand basis and got to see that it's effects. That it's not only particularly for quail, there comes a point after fire that things get too clogged up at ground level, and they're really looking for more open structure at ground level. And that sometimes can happen as quickly as 18 months to 2 years after the most recent fire has come through. One of the things that he may have seen, for example, this is a map of a study that we did on the Wade Tract a few years ago. And the yellow was an area that was going to be subjected to a May burn. And in there you see that grid work of points that we did counts on prior to the burn. We did counts 2 weeks before the burn, and we did surveys after the burn took place, and just shows what happens in these areas before and after a burn comes through. And here are the quail numbers on that particular study. They're down pretty low right when before the fire came through, and afterwards quail moved into the area. Again, the vegetation was so thick at ground level that the quail had probably stopped using that area as significantly as they would, and so they tripled in number just a few weeks after the burn. Still, Stoddard probably had pretty good data, but this was also still a time of suppression, and there was a lot of resistance to the news that he was trying to provide. In fact, he went back to Washington after the 5-year study and started writing up the book. And each time he submitted it for review, he was told to change the fire chapter. They didn't want to see that sort of information going out into the public, that fire might actually have some beneficial uses. He tried to correct it several times and revised the thing and sent it back in. It got rejected again and revised it again and sent it back in. It came to a point, he finally passed the word that the fire chapter, already sadly watered down, would have to be cleared for publication, or else I would resign and write a book on the subject that would not compromise. And at this point, they sort of had an understanding about what it might say and allowed it to be published. And so then in 1931, famous bobwhite quail, its habits, preservation, and increases were published by Stoddard, and it actually was probably the start of wildlife management profession in North America, as we'll talk about in a second. But I'd like to point out how controversial this particular statement was, which was just basically something as simple as the bobwhite undoubtedly evolved in an environment that was occasionally subject to occasional burning over. It wasn't much more stringent than that. And this was the thing that seemed so controversial at the time when it was first suggested. We of course know that this is the case, that actually our southern pine woods burn very frequently. Jean Huffman, for example, has done this wonderful work looking at tree scars on ancient stumps that she finds in the forest floor. The scars can actually be dated using the tree rings to figure out when they occur and what season they took place. From some of her work, for example, from 1680 to 1870, the fire return intervals on these stumps was 2 to 3 years throughout most of the areas she's looked at in Florida. And the variability is pretty low. And most of the fires also, with the highest intervals of most of the fires came through at least every 5 years or more frequently. And then the majority of them in that 2 to 3 year return interval. So again, fires are very frequent. And this too, I like to point out, was probably a time when the Native American population was not quite as large as it had been in years before. There's a lot of cultural burning that the Native Americans did, but after the different sort of diseases that were swept through from European colonization, probably the number of Native Americans in Florida was not quite as high as it was back historically. So this was just pointing to this was probably a natural and not a cultural source for fire. And as I mentioned, this sort of launched the entire field of wildlife management. And one of the first persons to recognize what Stoddard was doing was Aldo Leopold. And just basically, the quail book basically put together the life history, the fundamental ecology of the bird, And then also Stoddard developed a system of practice for the landowner, which was basically applied ecology. So it's a great example of studying an animal, figuring out what it needs, and then applying those ecological principles to managing the animal. Prior to this point, the main management tool used for quail was to set bag limits. It didn't consider necessarily what the habitat needs of the animal were or things like that, but just basically what they thought the hunters could take on an annual basis. And this shifted the thinking in wildlife management towards how do we care for the habitat that the animal needs in order to sustain the hunting that we'd like to see. Well, after Stoddard published his book, he moved, he's up in Washington when this happened. And one of the landowners here in the region, Colonel Thompson, realized that to have his sort of philosophy applied on a large scale, they really needed to have Stoddard back in the region. This landowner deeded Stoddard 1,000 acres and allowed him to live in his home, which is the home that he lived in when he was doing the work originally a few years earlier. And we like to call this the Stoddard stipend. And those of us who work at Tall Timbers hope that there's a Stoddard stipend for some of us someday, but it's probably not going to happen. Anyway, Stoddard moved back down into the region and began consulting business, working on all the properties in the region, helping them to manage their properties for quail and using fire in a manner that really provided good quail numbers and met a lot of other ecological needs too. As part of this too, this suddenly became Stoddard's book made him quite a famous person. And so he started getting attention from not just people in North America, but from all over the world would come to visit him here in this small little town in Georgia, talk with him about fire and land management. Shown also on the right there is Ed Comerick, who was a famous mammologist who moved into the area to manage greenwood plantation and became great friends with Stoddard. And so here we had in this small, community in Georgia, these two great minds about ecological management for forest and wildlife. And people from all over started visiting to figure out what they were doing down here and how it was working. Leopold visited him as well too. And years later, he wrote that he just spent several days with Stoddard and came away with the conviction that he's been too modest about the conservation measures he has worked out for the Southeast. He really has developed principles which are equally applicable to lumber companies, national forests, and all other owners of coastal plain longleaf. And it just really, Leopold was real struck by how Stoddard was doing all this great work. Stoddard didn't write as well as Leopold, but he was certainly doing hands-on work on the ground. It was making a big difference in how southern pine forests were being managed in the region. Soon into the 40s, Pearl Harbor, the war years came on, and there was suddenly a new interest in these lands in our area, plus elsewhere in the Southeast. The war effort brought along a new interest in using the pine forest, particularly the heartwood, to these landing boats particularly were ones that had a lot of heartwood pine that were used to construct them. There's a lot of pressure being put on landowners to provide some of that. Most of the other old growth pines of longleaf and other pines had been cleared at this point, and so there's a lot of interest in developing some of these tools. And landowners here in the region were interested in providing these sorts of resources to the war effort. And so there was suddenly a little bit of pressure on these properties, which heretofore had not been cutting their timber very much, to start providing timber for the war effort. And this led Stoddard into a new area, which was to devise a system of forest management that could provide these resources, but also not liquidate the forest, if you will. He basically developed a system that sort of mimicked some of the natural disturbances, but also never clear cut, but just took what the forest was growing at an annual basis. He was living off the interest that was accruing on the principle of the forest rather than cutting into the principle. The idea would be that you do selective cutting of single trees here and there, sort of like as the lighting might do in the forest. You don't go through and clear cut large acreages at a time, but you go through and selectively pull a few trees here and a few trees there. The other thing in doing it, it's a very selective thing of which trees you harvest. You might take them based on the vigor of the growth. The tree on the right here, maybe not growing as vigorously as the other one, and it might be a subject for culling. And then there's some other reasons too that you might select different trees. One of the ones that they've included were what they call character trees, these sort of gnarly old pines that have these weird growth forms. And we now know that some of these canopy structures actually can convey some advantages to these pines under certain climate conditions, whereas other canopy structures convey benefits at other times. And Stoddard was actually looking at this sort of thing, is that there may be a purpose to some of these sort of gnarly forms that are out there. And also they use this sort of character tree as another selection criteria or a reason to avoid taking the tree. Another consideration was it actually wove in considerations for rare species, such as the red cockaded woodpecker. Stoddard had always been fascinated by the woodpeckers. When he watched them in the woods, he actually understood that the heartwood was being rotted out by a fungus, but he also thought that this was the most southern, the species most emblematic of the southern pine woods that we had. And he actually takes special care to leave the older trees they knew would have the heart rot in areas where he had woodpeckers nesting, and actually developed these little areas where he was maintaining slightly older aged trees in the area to help support future cavity trees for the woodpecker. The important aspect of Stoddard's system is that the forest is generally always accumulating volume, and you're again just cutting the interest that accrues on the forest volume growth. So the forest is accruing at a rate of 2.5% per year. Say every 10 years, you can come in and take 15% of what would be 1.5% of the growth of the trees on the property and not cut into the principal, but just live off the interest here. And this is what we now know as the Stoddard-Neal massive forest harvest system. Stoddard and they continue to have these meetings at his house there, and it brought in Comeric and some other people to talk about land management and what the sort of interesting things they should be doing. Shown here is a meeting where it included two landowners. The person there with the pipe on the right is Henry Beadle, and the one right next to him is Colonel Topson, who had originally given the Stoddard the house there to live in. And so he's talking, the land managers were attending some of these meetings as well too. And one of the big subjects that came up was that with all the information that's been generated here about ecological management, the need for fire and these other things that were kind of not really well known elsewhere, that we really needed a private research facility to sort of actually figure out what was going on, because the information being produced by a lot of government sources at this point was not quite up to facts. And Stoddard and these people started planning out what would be eventually Tall Timbers Research Station. Henry Beadle, shown in that picture, had about 2,000 acres, and he was very impressed with Stoddard's work. He didn't have any heirs. So in 1958, he dedicated his property to the founding of Tall Timbers Research Station. And that's how we got our setup here. And the goal being to study fire equation, of fire ecology, game species management, and other things in the southern forest, and to figure out, how best to do that with the idea that the fire and everything's are a very important component of all this operation. So Stoddard started researching fire in a more detailed manner. And one of the first things he did, not knowing exactly what the return interval should be in these sort of systems, was he set up a bunch of these fire plots all across the property. These little purple squares here are half-acre plots that he envisioned burning at different times of the year. And one thing that this experiment sort of really shows cases real nicely is Stoddard getting quantitative. He had been sort of impressed with people like Eugene Odom, who were starting to do really sort of quantitative ecology work. And Stoddard wanted to realize the importance of numbers and supporting what you were studying and what you were claiming was happening. Stoddard set these fire plots up in a sort of like a randomized block design, where these plots were set on different soil types and then replicated on those soil types. But then he also had the treatment sort of randomized on the blocks. The treatments being burning every 1 year, every 2 years, every 3, every 4. And this extended out up to even 75 years he was considering. And there were actually 81 of these plots that they set up on the property at the time. The results were pretty clear from the beginning, based on the 1 year return interval. If you show in the lower right-hand corner here, that's a 1 year return interval since 1958, showing the very few hardwoods, the open grassy conditions. To the left of it is a 2 year burn interval. The hardwoods are starting to come in, but they're not overwhelming. And in the top two show the 3 and 4, where the hardwoods are getting in there too much and starting to have the effect on the fire, and probably not allowing the managers to meet the objectives they have of maintaining those balance of grasses and low statured hardwoods on the system as much as they'd like. So based on our system here in the Red Hills region, if you go much beyond 2 years, you're going into danger zone there, where you're going to be losing some of the attributes of the open grassy conditions that are sought for these southern pine woods. The other thing that Stoddard did at this time was launched into another phenomenal study that he did. He asked the owner, Henry Beadle, if they could put a TV tower on the property. And Beadle first didn't like the idea, but Stoddard realized that there was a person who wanted to put a TV tower and wanted to put it somewhere. And if he put it here on tall timbers, he could study what happened when the tower was in place. And so Beadle eventually agreed to let it happen. And Stoddard set up this system on the north side of tall timbers where he mowed the grass. He came out each morning and surveyed the birds that had been killed at the TV tower the night before. He realized this mortality was going to be taking place someplace, and it would be good for him to be best if it happened in a place that someone could study it and make some use of the information. So he did this for many years, basically getting up at 4 o'clock each morning to come out there and pick up the birds. And it's reported that he only took 2 weeks off during the entire time that he did this for about 14 years. It's a phenomenal effort, but it just shows his commitment to doing hard work when he says he has an interesting question that he wants to address. As this graph shows, the peak periods, the fall migration, when a bunch of juveniles mixed in with adults, is one where higher mortality. But they also did things such as ship the birds up for lipid analysis and got a very good picture of what the movement patterns were for certain species, how some come through earlier and some later. They got a lot of valuable information that wasn't really available before the study started. Also, one thing that's always amazing to me that his taxidermy skills show clearly through whenever you look at some of the specimens. You can pick out Stoddard's specimen in our museum just with a quick look. This, for example, shows a warbler, blue-winged warbler, and they look lifelike in size and shape and form. And this was something that Stoddard could put together in about 45 minutes after having the bird back at the lab. Well, the other thing that Stoddard did at this time too was he was working on a lot of the other properties in the region, and he came across this tract on one of the properties owned by the Wade family. I'm not sure why this thing's advancing without me pressing the button, but I'll try to keep ahead of it here. Stoddard realized that this reminded him of what he'd seen down in South Florida with the old growth trees still there. And the ground cover conditions in great condition. And Stoddard really, after having watched the longleaf system ripped out and cut throughout most of the Southeast, took a look at this particular tract and saw that there's a great opportunity here to study the longleaf system in an old growth setting. And that was really a phenomenal idea at the time. He worked with the family. He actually wrote Jeff Wade, the owner, a letter back in 1961 talking about how valuable this tract would be for research, that none of us today can see all the values the block will have for generations to come. So this is Stoddard writing a letter in 1961 when probably old growth is on the minds of many people here in the country. Of course, it takes two to tango, and he had a willing audience on the idea. It didn't happen before Stoddard's death, but in 1978, Jeff and Patty Wade gave an easement to the Wade Tract, which allows researchers to come on and study the ecology of the site, but also prevents any future cutting taking place in the area, and basically set that area aside for future cutting. And we should also recognize that Patty Wade also recently purchased one of the most important longleaf sites in our area, or even in the Southeast, when she purchased Greenwood a few years ago. That's where Ed Comerick got his launch, and we really owe the Wade family a lot of gratitude for the efforts they've done in helping to conserve these old forest systems here, as well as Stoddard. Some of the things you couldn't have foreseen, for example, the red-cockaded woodpeckers on the Wade Tract. This is probably one of the only places in the Southeast that the woodpecker has been there for several hundred years. Most of the other sites we have worked on with woodpecker were cut at some point. But you look at the yellow dots on the right, those are all the cavity trees that these woodpeckers are using on the Wade Tract. There's basically about one red-cockaded cavity tree for every 7 to 10 acres, which is just phenomenal abundance of these cavity trees on the site. And it's probably what the historical conditions for this species look like, not the 4 inserts or so that we're now using to maintain the species on the second growth forest, but the cavities being widely spread, thick throughout the entire property, and available not only for red-cockadeds, but for other species of cavity nesting birds. We also know the home range, for example, on the Wade Tract are about half of what they are on most public lands with second growth forests. So these woodpeckers can really pack it in and make a good deal of, don't need quite as much territory as they do on these old second growth forests, the old growth forest providing very better foraging conditions for them, as well as these tremendous cavity resources. This shows a plot of, we did a lot of point counts on properties in the region here, which all have great forest resources. The Wade Tract is shown on the right there. These are the number of cavity nesting birds we detected each of the point counts. And the Wade Tract is high above all the others, even though they're very well managed sites in terms of the diversity of cavity nesting birds. And these are the kind of unexpected things that Stoddard thought the Wade Tract would be able to provide. And just along with it, in addition to just the woodpecker, there's scores of other examples like this, from ground cover conditions to the gopher tortoises, that we've learned so much about the ecology of these organisms by studying species on the Wade Tract. The other thing about this too is this is now in recognition of Stoddard. This is the only national natural landmark that's dedicated to the longleaf system. And the kind of question is, we hope to see some of this develop on public lands in the future, because it's very rare for us to find this on public land. We have a lot of people would like to see the Wade Tract, would like to study it, but we have very strict limitations on who can come on the property and who gets to see it. So I hope someday we have more stuff looking like this on public lands. And this, just to harken back again to Stoddard in his early days, he loved longleaf, he loved southern pine forest, and later on in life, he just noticed that one of the things that was sort of amazing to him, at one time, he was classed by many as an enemy of these forests because of my written and spoken insistence that the pine forest not only could be burned, but indeed should be burned. Another interesting aspect of Stoddard in later in life was his concern and interest in other rare species. This is the Chipola River Wildlife Sanctuary area. Stoddard and some other people heard rumors of ivory-billed woodpeckers being in this area. They visited it and saw it, and they didn't actually see an ivory-bill, but thought conditions looked good, and they tried to get a national wildlife refuge set up here along the sanctuary, just in case the ivory-bills could still persist in the region. Stoddard actually went out of his way anytime that there was a reporting of an ivory-billed woodpecker in the region to try to chase it down. He had seen them down when he was in his childhood over east of Orlando, and he saw one in Thomasville in 1951. He saw one over the Okefenokee, but he's very interested in trying to find spots where this bird might hold on and maybe set up a sanctuary for the bird so it could persist in that area. So this is Stoddard, and what he did outside of just quail management fire. He was just all over the place and doing great things. Some of the great legacies are his focus on habitat, not bag limits, what he called integrative management, what today we might call ecosystem management, in terms of caring for game species, rare species, as well as the ecological conditions in the forest. He was first a big, huge proponent of fire ecology and got this entire area of science underway. Profession of Wildlife Management launched with his publication of the Quail Management Book. Again, before that time, he was primarily bag limits, but Stoddard developed a recipe for how to manage habitat to support game species. And this was really the launch of an entire science about managing game species. And also, he had great values for rare species and old growth forests. And this is another thing that really sets him apart from a lot of his other peers, just having all these different interests and great knowledge. And also all of this capped up in a person who only had an 8th grade education. Another legacy extends beyond tall timbers. Archbold Biological Station, the Archbold family have spent some time in the Red Hills region, and were part of the patriarch of that particular station there was actually in the meeting that took place in New York there, and heard about Stoddard and talked to Stoddard many times over the years. The Jones Ecological Research Station, of course, has strong ties with Stoddard and Stoddard, and then there's the Burley Stoddard Research Fund up at Georgia, University of Georgia too. So Stoddard's legacy in a bunch of different, very important research stations here in the Southeast, as well as a major supporter of research at the University of Georgia. He's also partially responsible for the listing of the red-cockaded woodpecker and the renewed interest, the interest in the bird. Stoddard's notes about the bird were just right on about its ecology and what it needed. And when the bird was actually listed in '74, 4 years after Stoddard died, they relied upon a lot of his information to support the listing of the species. He's also very instrumental in having the National Wildlife Refuge established down at St. Mark's. He spent a lot of time along the coast trying to watch bird migration and was very interested in the waterfowl management down there and the coastal setting, and wrote letters in support of the nomination of the refuge down there and getting it established. And also, I think the biggest thing, though, is what I like about Stoddard is, or what is to me the most striking, is his way he spans the sort of Audubon era, basically collect and put a museum, you know, what is this and where is it? And then into the modern era of quantitative ecology, so represented by Eugene Odom. Stoddard had feet in both sides of this coin and began as sort of the taxidermist collecting things, documenting rare species occurrences, unusual observations of species. And towards later on in his life, he became very quantitative and sort of figuring out, you know, the fire return intervals and how that might be affected by soils and other complex interactions. And so he really spanned both of these important eras in research here in North America. And again, just with an 8th grade education. References for this material, there's the Bobby Crawford's wonderful book about the history of Tall Timbers Research Station. It has a lot of great information. The Conserving Longleaf, a look by Albert Way. Albert Way actually did his dissertation studying Herbert Stoddard and his impacts on the conservation in North America. And also, again, with Paul Stoddard and Albert Way, again, talking about the art of managing longleaf, a personal history of the Stoddard Mill approach to forestry. And these are all very valuable, have a lot of wonderful insights. And of course, his Memoirs of Natural is, I think, a must read for anyone operating in the Southeast, just because it gives a wonderful picture of a person who's very dedicated, person always inspired by being out in nature, and also willing to take flack for something that he thought was right, and especially the use of prescribed fire. With that, I'll stop sharing and open up this thing for any questions there might be out there.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jim. I enjoyed the presentation, and we have a great audience on the line today. If you joined us after the introduction, this was a presentation by Jim Cox. He's the director of the Stoddard Bird Lab at Tall Timbers Research Station in Tallahassee, Florida. So at this point in our program, I'd like to provide an opportunity for everyone to ask questions. So you can type your questions into the Q&A tool in Zoom, and that'll allow us to have some structure as we get through those. We do have a feature enabled that will allow you to give a little thumbs up vote for questions presented by other folks. And so if you see another question that you really want us to be able to get to, go ahead and give it a vote, and that'll help us to prioritize as we get through those. So let's go ahead and pull these. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
About what Stoddard might consider to be the most important thing management of public lands now in the Southeast. I still think it's fire. We are unfortunately way behind what's needed on a lot of public lands in terms of the frequency with which fire is returning to the sites, and that's probably what he would still sort of emphasize as the most important thing that's to be doing. I'm sure he also talked about how we can manage for timber without liquidating the forest. And so that's another thing I think he would be working on too, because we still haven't really cracked that nut either, to where it's actually being applied large scale on a lot of public lands.
There's a question that came in from Kate Snyder in the chat window, and it's interesting. She says, did Stoddard do any work or research on flatwoods ecosystems or other sites outside of Tall Timbers and the Red Hills?
Yeah, he did a little bit. I mean, he did some work down around St. Mark's, but it wasn't quite as intensive. I wouldn't really say that he did a ton of work outside of the systems here in the Red Hills that I'm aware of. I know that he mentioned some grasslands up north. I don't think he actually stayed long enough to try different treatments on them. And the flatwoods, you know, most of that was from what he learned from growing up in the flatwoods down there and watching how fire was used. I think most of his stuff was very much focused on here in the Red Hills and what was being applied on Tall Timbers and some of the properties he was working on there.
There's a question that came in from Meyer. Did his lack of former education contribute to others not taking him seriously in his early work?
It could have, but actually I think, and I didn't mention this unfortunately, but I think that's what actually made him such a great match with the Red Hills region. Stoddard was a lot like the managers who were here in the Red Hills region who, they had the owners of the properties, but the managers themselves were probably a lot like Stoddard, didn't have a formal education, had been working on the land for decades. And Stoddard sort of matched nicely with their sentiment and knew what they were talking about, when they were talking about needs and how they address questions. I think that actually that formal education made him a great fit for this region, and he did work well in the academic setting for sure. But I think it also helped him in twofold. I don't think it hindered his stuff. I think it was just mostly the fact that there was a very hard suppression throughout almost all corners of just a few people even talking about fire as being something that might be useful at that time, and just a very long uphill stride to get it into consciences.
There's a question that came in the Q&A. Were there any native plants or legumes that Mr. Stoddard advocated replanting for the benefit of the longleaf community?
None to my knowledge right off.
Another question that came in from Dana: is Stoddard's house, is it still there? And who owns it, or and is there any efforts on preserving it for the long term or for the future?
It's still there, and I don't know who owns it right now, but there has been talk here about having a special designation of the house, and we have a separate section here that tends to deal with historic resources like that, and I'm not sure what headway has been made on that front. But actually, there's been some among staff here even trying to get it on the National Register, just like we have the Beetle House here on the National Register of Historic Places, and I'm just not sure how far that's gotten.
There's a question or a question in here in the Q&A from Devin, and Devin says, if it can be said that land management is based on stakeholders' needs, who, what, or what is ecosystem management based on?
Well, I think Stoddard took a lot on the stakeholders' need, but he also showed how ecological management could be performed. He was very much interested in satisfying what the landowners were interested in, but when he came across a place like the Wade Tract, as you can see, he tried to dissuade or to put the perspective of those particular landowners in towards the ecological value of the site. So it was on a case-by-case basis. I think if you were to ask Stoddard if he had a public land setting that or a property where he was given all to do what he would do, he would try to set it up as more of an ecological operation. He actually had this sort of notion of, in the Wade Tract, for example, he sort of saw that as an area that there wouldn't be public access, but there'd be opportunities for understanding the ecological processes there. He actually had that same philosophy in some of the grasslands where he consulted on up in the north central part of the country. He went up there and had an idea there about setting aside these small preserves where they could look at the ecological process. So I think as Stoddard had all of his druthers about what could happen on the property, he would set it up to a small tracts of these things to do ecological research, but also if he was in this area where there was an interest in hunting too, he would also swing towards that side of the needs too. I think there was a strong bent for him to admire places like the Wade Tract and stuff, and that had special conditions, but also is very much of an opinion to get the landowner what they were interested in seeing happening on the property.
A question in the chat from Laurel. What was his Stoddard's connection or relationship with Native Americans and their use of fire and their fire culture? Did he have any connections or interactions with Native Americans over the course of his career?
Not to my knowledge, no. I don't think. I think it all originated from the open range during his early childhood. That's where the introduction took place, and from his own application and watching what happened when he was seeing how it was applied here on properties in the Red Hills.
Another question from Patty that came in the Q&A. She says, you showed a slide comparing the winter burns. Did Stoddard have any projects or plots where he looked at other burn seasons outside of winter?
The fire plots did have a seasonal component to them, and it wasn't quite as broad as we might think of today as, transition versus early transition versus winter versus some other season. But he did have that in mind. I think, though, that some of the sites we're studying on tall timbers, for example, they're old field sites, which we really have to burn them at certain times of the year just because some of the grasses aren't present that are on some of the native ground cover areas. So I think that I think he would have considered season more, if he lived longer, to 200 years or something like that. But during his time, it was just trying to figure out the frequency and what could be applied on a bunch of different settings, native ground cover as well as old field.
There's an interesting question that came in from Fred in the Q&A just now. He says it appears that Stoddard worked lands that were initially in pretty good condition. He says, did he work on any cutover lands as part of restoring those sites?
Nope, he started, the properties that we were working on here were in very, very good condition. And so there's not as much restoration work that he accomplished during his lifetime.
Mm-hmm. A question early on from Stephen asking about the books that you were showing in one of your last slides to provide, people who want to dig in some more. Do you know where could folks find some of those books?
Well, sure. The history book you can order online here at Tall Timbers. Bert Way's book about Stoddard's lifetime achievements is, I'm not sure if it's maybe carried in some local bookstores here. I know that the one in Thomasville that we have has occasionally has some of his books there on the shelves. I'm not sure about Tallahassee. And depending on where you live, of course, online is the way to kind of get some of these articles or some of these books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a copy of Memoirs of a Naturalist, and I think that came from eBay. And Albert Way's book, I think that was online, and Leon Neal's book, maybe also online as well. Let's see, a question that came in to the chat. Mike says, no doubt Mr. Stoddard was one of the pioneers of applied forest ecology, which most of us would call silviculture. He says, part art and part science. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yes, it is part art and part science, and there's a lot of room for wiggle in those settings there too. But I agree with that. I have not done enough. Each site's sort of unique and what it needs and what you have to do. And I can think of some places, especially with fires involved, you have to keep in mind the overstory and the needle drop that comes from those areas. And there's certain things that you can get away with and certain things that you can't, but it really is site specific. We have very rich soils here in the Red Hills region, which the vegetation grows back quickly from. You can get away with a lot of other, with the sandier soils on sand hills and stuff. The rotation of the fire return interval can be much longer. But here in the Red Hills region, we have these rich soils that if you don't treat it very, very quickly, and if you don't have a nice canopy cover, you can lose the system pretty quickly.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jim. It looks like we have run up to the end of our time today. After all those questions we've received, do you have any other parting thoughts or comments that you'd like to share with everyone to take home?
Well, I just, every day I drive up, I think about Stoddard and what he did here. And I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of the very important role that he played, not just here in the Southeast. We like Muir, we like those big grandiose landscapes that were created out west. Of course, that came at a time when the West was still very new and had not been trampled over. And something like the Wade Tract to me is equivalent to 10,000 acres of great, old growth out west, because it's so rare here in our system. We had someone here who recognized the importance of it, and we can thank him for leaving us with the small vestiges of it here as well, and also for setting up a system for managing southern pinelands that we're still exploring and working with today, but really settled around the framework which needed to be used when tackling this issue.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. What a legacy, both in thought and in places.